Okay, let's jump right into this. So, thinking about the current environment, um, I have to draw on my own experience, and I'm in a business, primarily the airline business, which is an absolute free fall. In terms of front line of impact, there probably really is no other industry that has been so globally devastated by what we see today. And just some of the headline numbers, they're really, frankly, very, very scary. We're talking about capacity drops across the world of 65% in Q2, and that's projected to continue throughout the year. There have been, from January up until June, already there have been 2 million flights have been canceled. And IATA, which is the international body that kind of is the trade association for airlines around the world, their most conservative estimate, and they're updating all the time, is that year over year, we're looking at about $252 billion loss in revenue, which is almost a 50% decline. So those numbers are really, they're quite startling. They create an environment that frankly is almost unestimable in terms of its impact. It's particularly difficult in the airline business because we are a business about connectivity in an age of social distancing. What we're seeing, and this is fascinating numbers, there are 25,000 commercial airliners around the world. At this point, and it's growing every day, over 40% of them are actually parked. So all over the world, we see thousands and thousands of airplanes that are just sitting idle. But behind every airplane are, of course, those impacted workers. And as an industry, we're looking at over 25 million jobs around the world that potentially are impacted when airlines go dark. So we are in this dark period, and it's a dark period we've never been in before. Having said that, there are some lessons of the past. And when I say lessons of the past, I think for the airline industry, most impactful, most immediately impactful was, of course, 9/11. But indeed, it really does, the airline business follows GDP growth and contraction. So it's an industry that's a pretty good bellwether for how the economy is doing. So it is impacted severely by things like the economic meltdown in 2008 and other times. I think that as a leader of airlines during those times, it all comes back to a couple of simple rules that we as managers of business have to remind ourselves of. Number one, we do have control over some levers. So it's not a completely powerless situation. Number two, it's absolutely imperative that when we act quickly and we act decisively. And paramount in any actions is communication, whether it's communication amongst ourselves, to our employees, to our customers, across the industry. So all of those are, I think, are, if you will, principles by which as we kind of look forward, as we look toward beyond Armageddon into recovery, we need to carry with us. I'd also like to actually just take a moment, and this is not economics 101, but I think that we need to remind ourselves, it's good to kind of ground ourselves in the history, not just of the immediate past, but the long past. There have been over 55 economic contractions and expansion periods, some including recessions, but there have been 55 of these periods since 1850. And so it is a natural cycle that we see. Regrettably, we're heading very, very rapidly towards hopefully what will be a trough for a period of expansion again. But I think we should take some comfort in knowing that this is a pretty durable world that we live in. What we don't know, of course, is the intensity of this current crisis, and we don't know the duration. The one thing that is what is a little bit uncertain, but also quite worrying, frankly, is what we are seeing is that over time, there has been an increase. Over the last 50 years, we're seeing a longer interval between peak to peak. And this is something which I think is something we need, it's a data point that we need to bring forward with us when we try to answer the question of how long will this last, and really what will the intensity of it be. The other thing that's very interesting is if you read what economists say about recoveries, there are some general kind of geometries of recovery. And that's something which I think is, there's a challenge in here for all of us. If you break that geometry down into ABCs, there are basically three different types of recoveries. The first is a V-shaped recovery. And I pulled here some data from that came from Harvard Business Review, looking at Canada's experience post-financial meltdown in 2008. And you'll see in the line here, you've got what the growth trend had been prior to the crisis, and then the pink line is the actual growth. So Canada up at the top. And what you'll see is Canada did take a drop, but was able to close the gap and return to growth. And this is the most idealized form of any type of recovery. If we look at the US during this period, they experienced what was called a U-shaped recovery. And the U-shape is essentially, you never recover the output that you lost, albeit in the case of the US, it did pick up at a similar growth rate, but it never made up that difference. So it's a much more damaging type of recovery. Now, the worst type of recovery that all countries need to avoid is what is known as the L-shaped recovery. And in this case, unfortunately, Greece, following the crisis of 2008, really never recovered the output, nor recovered the growth. So really, the hope here, the best case scenario is a V. The U is a real possibility. And I think the challenge for all of us as business leaders, as governmental leaders, is to get as close to a V shape as possible. So this is something that just may be a visualization of what we may be shooting for or hope to be shooting for. I do think that, even though recessions, expansions, et cetera, are normally measured in GDP growth, we have to understand that we're in an extremely dynamic environment today, and there are a lot of indicators. There are a lot of areas that are impacted, obviously. Unemployment being, or the employment numbers being one of the most important. Employment, what we've seen is that the time to recovery after a major shock over time has actually increased. And we're actually at a point right now, following the 2008 crisis, it took over 40 months for unemployment numbers to be reduced to levels pre-crisis. So I do think that all of this taken together is a pretty good harbinger of a recovery that is going to be bumpy, it's going to be long. And we need to prepare for something which is going to be multifaceted. It will not be a straight line. And that, when I think of our businesses, when I'm thinking of the airline work I'm doing today, when I think about my small businesses, these are the kind of the assumptions that I'm playing with walking in. I think, though, that one of the most important things is that we really take the time, give the deference to the impact of this crisis from a psychological standpoint. And in economic terms, it really comes down to consumer confidence. I pulled out the numbers from the Conference Board of Canada that just released over the weekend their most recent confidence polling. So looking at the last week of March, what we saw was absolutely unprecedented in terms of the impact on consumer confidence. This demonstrates that really looking at a 1 week period, we saw that the most precipitous drop, 41-point drop, the biggest in history, and confidence levels right now are at the lowest in history. And just by comparison, what's so startling about this is the speed with which this drop has occurred. If we compare it to the 2008 period, it took over a year to reach the trough, if you will, in confidence. So this is the intensity of what we're experiencing right now is truly the unprecedented thing, I think, when we think about business cycles and recovery. So is there a silver lining? Well, and I don't say this facetiously, but there is something that may work in our favor, and that is that, there is something called the forgetting curve. How quickly do we, as a society, how quickly do we forget? How quickly do we move on? What is our memory? And I think the human psyche here is such an important part of recovery. So as business people, we really do have to spend an appropriate amount of time in reflection, I think, thinking about fundamentally, how will the consumer sentiment, how will consumer perception, how will the consumer mindset change? So maybe this is the kind of lead into what can we do? And what I'm going to do is I'd like to shift gears a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about the way that I've kind of made sense of things and maybe the structure I've tried to put around some of my thinking. This may or may not be relevant for you, but hopefully in some way it's at least it's a little bit of a how one guy is thinking about things. But I think that one of the simple ways that I've made sense of things is recognizing that we do have power, we do have control over or certain elements of things around us. And I like to think of it in terms of the circles around us. First and foremost, it's the family and you. And in concentric terms, then it's your business, and then it's your customers, but then it's also your community. And I think each one of these arenas allows us, if we're grounded, if we're thoughtful, to really think about what actions can we take. Hopefully by this time, the rhythm of life is now settled in for you and your families. Hopefully you've adjusted to remoteness, physical distancing, all the elements that have imbued this crisis. With your business, I want to spend more time talking about business, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what I see as maybe the 3 stages of what we can be doing for our businesses. But then jumping to customers, I really do hope that all of you are putting a priority on your customers. They were there when you last did business with them. They'll be there when we move through this. So I think the customer communication during a time of crisis is absolutely critical. And there are ways of doing it in a very kind of open, transparent way, showing that you care, being proactive in that communication. There are a number of steps that we can take, I think, to stay close to our customers during this time. And it's absolutely critical that we do that. But I also believe that, one of the values that has been challenged and may actually be reordered in this is the way we think about community. This has really put a spotlight on the meaning of community. And, I think that we all have a part to play, even at this time, thinking about how can we lend a shoulder for community to lean on. There are the newspapers, the stories, the social media is replete with acts of tremendous kindness that are being done out there. The hope is, of course, that maybe this will turn into a legacy. Maybe we will rethink how we actually relate to community. So I don't know if it's helpful or not, but for me, thinking about these concentric circles has given me some order to the way I'm thinking about how do we move forward. And I just want to jump back to the circle of business. And this is something which, I think born out of my 30 years of being challenged by certain business cycles and events. I've kind of settled on not a formula, because nothing's formulaic, but I think that there are some general trends or general stages of any recovery that we need to perhaps think further about. One is the immediate response, if you will. And I'm sure that everyone who owns a business is a business leader today is well almost beyond this now. But the primary focus during this period really has to be around cash preservation and cost containment. I'm assuming at this point, every business leader has looked at all their costs, scrubbed them, determined what they can actually in their variable cost pile set aside for the moment, how they can actually, from a cost structuring standpoint, really look at their fixed overheads. Hopefully they will have pursued such avenues as looking at rent abatements, looking at how they're actually going to deal with the very real needs of their employees while also being responsible for their business. So response is something I think we all went through during the first couple of weeks. I would hope that we're now at a point where we can start focusing on what are the prerequisites, what are the recovery capacities we have to build at this point in time. And I think this is primarily around the health check that's required for everyone's balance sheet. Contraction, recession, recovery, it really is about the availability or the lack of availability of capital and liquidity. And the balance sheet is probably the greatest focal point for looking at this. There are a number of liquidity programs that the government has put together. In fact, I think At this point, there are over 1,000 federal and provincial programs that are potentially relevant for businesses and individuals. And I'm really pleased that we've got the government representatives on board today so they can talk further about that. So I'm not going to steal their thunder. But I think that from a liquidity standpoint, there are a lot of formalized approaches that can be taken to secure liquidity at this time. From a capital standpoint, there are also things that can be done. If you have not spoken to your tax accountant, now is the time to do so. The CRA does have provisions for capital loss carry forwards and carry backs. There are a number of ways of actually looking at one's balance sheet and looking at generating cash for recovery. So I think this second stage is extremely important, and this is where I'm focused, and I would hope that some of the listeners today are also doing similarly. But I think that the last stage, and this is what Andrew Cohen, I think, was challenging us to do, and that really is, let's think about reconstruction. So what is the new world order? And as business owners, as business leaders, this is the place where we really need to be focused right now. So the liquidity programs we talked about, and again, some of the other speakers will go further into this. But it's not only the well-publicized emergency support, emergency wage benefit programs. The one I want to draw your attention to that I have been focused on from a business ownership perspective is the emergency business account, which is the loans to small business. If any of the listeners today have not spent any time getting to know this program, I would strongly urge them to do so. It's probably one of the strongest things that a small business owner could be pursuing at this point in time. But in addition to that, there's so many programs that are pre-existing programs where the terms, the conditions have been relaxed. And again, we're very, very fortunate in the response that Canada has put together, in contrast to many other jurisdictions around the world. I think that we're in a pretty good shape with regards to trying to pump the liquidity into the market to aid the recovery. All right, so let's talk about the business. So these are a couple of questions that I've been asking myself, and my partners have been asking, together we've been asking ourselves about our businesses. We all got into business because we had a vision, because we believed that vision is something we bring to life. This is an ideal time to say, is your vision still intact? And that is really, I think, the starting point for thinking about planning for recovery. If it is, given the changed environment, it's more than likely that you're going to have to adjust your roadmap. And that roadmap is made up of milestones. So really, how do you prepare your business? How do you plan your business against an adjusted roadmap with new milestones? So what are those milestones going to be? How has your customer's sentiment changed? How will their behaviors change? What sort of impact will that make on your business? What have you learned about how people buy during this period that necessarily you may want to actually integrate into the ways of doing business in the future? So really, the customer sentiment is extremely important. And taking a point of view of, are there any relevant behaviors that drove your business before that you need to adjust to? But most importantly, the underlying theme on this, of course, is what are you doing today to prepare for tomorrow? It's been demonstrated time after time that businesses that use a downtime, that use a period of crisis to really push themselves to think further forward, will perform much better during the expansion and recovery. So, there are so many different approaches to planning a business out of hardship. But I think it really does start with questions, and these are some of the questions that I've been asking myself, and my partners have been asking themselves. So I think that leads really then to mindset of consumer. And I think that this is really something that, given the intensity of what we're going through, given the fact that we've got a recovery where recovery won't come just by economic means, but also with the mitigation of the underlying event that caused it. And that is, the underlying precepts of the virus itself. This is unlike any other potential recovery where it will have lasting impacts on the way I think the consumers see the world. So the question really is, what are some of the values that are going to be reordered? The way we understand time today, it's being challenged. Is that going to have a lasting effect? You know, the idea of being time poor, what does that actually mean in recovery? What does community mean in recovery? Is there going to be as much primacy or much importance placed on green consumerism, ethical consumerism? All the things that were trends that actually came out of, and I don't mean just trends in a superficial way, but I mean fundamental changes in consumer behavior and interest following the 2008 crisis. What is that going to do to these behaviors, if you will, as we move forward? Will frugality, thrift, is that going to be an emerging value that consumers are going to place? Simplicity. Are people looking, you know, in this day and age where the shopping, the retail experience has all been reduced to time on a computer? What is that going to do for people that have real retail experiences to offer? You know, how are we going to spend our leisure time? Extreme experiences, is that going to be as important? Are people going to be, is the pen up, the duress of today, is that going to spur people on to seek more, to explore more or less? And trust. I mean, if you think about our response to the virus has been all built on trust. It's been trust in government, trust in medical officials. Will the trust that we are not only that we are actually putting into trusted officials, is that something that we are going to actually transfer in expectation to the businesses that we choose to do business with coming out of this? So will there be heightened sense of trust? So these are all, I think, you know, some, but not all, these are all drivers of change. And I think that as business leaders, I think that we really, as we plan our business into recovery, we need to be thinking about that. So these are the things that are on my mind. Hopefully they give some perspective, some challenge, some thoughts for others as they're looking at how they're working through this. And I'd love to hear how people are faring and what's on their mind.